Why do the Jesuits have such a bad reputation? I Googled the Jesuits on Google using the internet Google, and one of the suggested search terms was something along the lines of, why do the Jesuits have such a bad reputation? So I think I'll try to answer that the best that I can. First of all, the Jesuits are founded in the middle of a sort of historical upheaval for the Catholic Church in Europe, right? The Protestant Reformation produced a lot of anti-Catholic thoughts, and the Jesuits were Catholic. The Jesuits loved the Pope. The Jesuits were working hard to preserve Catholicism, working hard to undo some of the work that the Protestant reformers were doing. And so the Jesuits get a bad reputation. A lot of very famous people said a lot of bad things about Jesuits. And, at a time when the Jesuits had some of the most impressive men that Europe had at the time doing the work that they were doing for the Jesuits. I'm thinking St. Ignatius Loyola, but Francis Xavier, Peter Canisius, Francis Borgia, eventually Robert Bellarmine. I mean, these are some fantastic Jesuits. I mean, really first-class intellects putting their efforts behind preserving the Catholic Church in Europe. So lots of people are going to say lots of bad things about an order that's doing that, right? Lots of people will say a lot of bad things about that. So the Protestant Reformation happened at such a time that I think, the Jesuits were doomed to have bad things said about them at the time. Now, the church vindicated the Jesuits, and a lot of those men that I just listed, they're saints, so these are good things, but some Jesuits even lost their heads over this sort of thing. So it was a rough time to start a new order with such, sort of staunch defenders of the faith. So some of the bad reputation comes from things like that right off the bat. Second, the Jesuits, the Jesuits are going to be highly educated. That's just how we are built with it. We've got a long formation where we are going to be highly educated. And so often, the Jesuits wound up in positions of great influence with world leaders. And so if your enemy has a Jesuit counseling him, you might say, not only is my enemy a bad person, but that it's probably because they're under the influence of that Jesuit. So there's this sense that there's sort of political manipulation going on by these Jesuits. I don't think that's really true, or at least not true in a totally negative sense, but certainly the Jesuits have been in influential positions, and so they're going to get caught up in a lot of those political intrigues that end up leaving the Jesuits with some kind of a bad reputation for manipulation, right? So for being overly Catholic, for manipulation, for sometimes for being a little too willing to stretch the rules, right? So I'm thinking of Jesuit missionary work. The Jesuit missionaries would, again, with their education, they would, and often mastery of the language of the people that they're going to go minister to, right, of these foreign cultures, they would go there and already know how to speak the language and do a good job of working to be in there with the culture of the native peoples that they were talking to, and willing to ask questions that are not really easily answered. So think about this. Okay, let's imagine you're a Franciscan working in China, and the Jesuits come in, and all of a sudden they make great headway in terms of endearing themselves to the emperor, in terms of learning to speak the language, in terms of teaching the people about Christianity. And here were these Franciscans who often, it's beautiful. Their charism is a beautiful thing, right? They often embrace poverty to a very, very, this incredible level where these Jesuits were saying, hey, forget poverty for a little while. We have to get in good with the emperor, and the emperor doesn't respect poverty, right? The emperor respects what you know about astronomy or whatever. So these Jesuits come in, and they're all astronomers, and they're not like holding on too tightly to their poverty. And so the Franciscans are like, well, what in the world is going on over here? In the meanwhile, the Jesuits are willing to ask big questions like, when we interact with these Chinese people, what do we call God? Do we call him by the Latin name that the Europeans use for God? They're going to call him Deus. Or are we going to call him by, like some word that is similar to the words that the Chinese were using for God, except they were going to say the one big version of God, right? Is that even theologically correct to compare the God we believe in to the gods that they believe in, only more powerful somehow? Or do we come up with a new word altogether? Or do we come up with some metaphor like the sun to refer to God, And so the Jesuits were asking these big questions, not even always agreeing with each other, but because they were doing this, of course, you're going to get some Franciscans who are going to look at this and say, that's bad. Those Jesuits are crazy. They're acting up. They're misbehaving over there in China, for example, right? Okay, so the Jesuits get a bad reputation for being kind of on the edge when it comes to the kind of work that they do as missionaries. I think these days we can look back and say, look at the great work that the Jesuit missionaries did. But at the time, they had questions about what the Jesuit missionaries were doing. I'm talking about in the Americas. I'm talking about in Asia, all over the world. People had criticisms for the Jesuits that way. In a similar way, or related to that, the Jesuits are going to be on the forefront even now in certain secular fields, right? Certain sciences, certain social sciences. The Jesuits are often on the forefront of things that are not immediately recognizable as Catholic, and some of those are even looked with suspicion on by Catholics. So I'm thinking of things like certain like economic theories, like Marxism or whatever. You can have all these Jesuits going to spend years and years and years studying this stuff. They kind of, the Jesuits are going to be very influential in something called liberation theology, right? Which I'm not a big fan of that, right? But there are lots of Jesuits who spent their lives trying to figure out this stuff and trying to kind of like come up with the best version of this understanding of what, liberation theology, a theology that God is here to help liberate the poor, And then you're going to have some, I don't know, some coup or some revolution or somebody somewhere who's going to say, the Jesuits taught us that God is on our side if we have this revolution against the rich or whatever. And so, of course, the Jesuits' reputation is going to suffer. And maybe that reputation is even earned, right? So I'm not even arguing that the Jesuits have nothing to do with any of this stuff. But I would say it's not fair to say that the Jesuits like this stuff. Not this Jesuit, not every Jesuit likes things like liberation theology, right? So I think some of that is unearned. Some of it might be earned, but some of it's unearned in terms of the Jesuits being on the edge when it comes to all kinds of things, both from missionary type stuff, but also in terms of education. Then you get this period of history where people who don't understand history very well, right? So like this comes up often for me at least, where people say, the Jesuits need to be suppressed again. The Jesuits were suppressed for about 40 years, right? Starting in 1773, Pope Clement XIV says that the Jesuits no longer legitimately exist as an order in the Catholic Church, right? They no longer have the right to operate as one of the approved orders of the Catholic Church. And those 40 years were very, very tough, right? The Society of Jesus was dissolved in a sense. And so 40 years later, Pope Pius VII, in like 1814, 40 whatever years later, they are restored because I think the Catholic Church recognized that what the Jesuits brought to the table was valuable, and they wanted what the Jesuits could do to be back in the church. But when they were suppressed, I think a lot of it had to do with a whole lot of political intrigue, a whole lot of misunderstanding, maybe even some pride on the part of the Jesuits, where they were very wealthy. For example, a lot of these kings and across Europe saw the opportunity to take what the Jesuits had. And they said that, we can just take all the stuff that the Jesuits have if we just carry out this order of the Pope. And so it was a very popular order for a lot of places. And the Jesuits just didn't think at the time that they needed to play those political games to stay, to stay where they were. They just assumed that they were untouchable. And it turned out not to be the case. So people today, and it's very complicated why they got suppressed, but people today, without any understanding of that at all, they just assume that the Jesuits got suppressed because, well, they must have gone out on a limb. They must have gotten too far out, too liberal with their theology. I mean, this is not the case at all. That would be a grave misunderstanding, or not even an oversimplification. I would say just a misunderstanding of exactly what happened. So the history of the suppression of the Jesuits, I think, can give the Jesuits a bad reputation. Then you have these conspiracy theories, right? You have some people who believe because the Jesuits are powerful and whatever, they think that somehow the Jesuits are behind the scenes pulling the strings on every politician. I mean, even like Abraham Lincoln believed that the Civil War was started because of the Jesuits. They couldn't have started the Civil War without the help of the Jesuits. I'm thinking of like Fyodor Dostoevsky, right? This is coming from, and I like Dostoevsky, but here's what he said: the Jesuits are simply the Romish army for the earthly sovereignty of the world in the future, with the pontiff of Rome for emperor. That's their ideal. It is simple lust of power, a filthy earthly gain of domination, something like a universal serfdom with the Jesuits as masters. That's all they stand for. They don't even believe in God, perhaps. I think you went a bit far. I think you went a bit far with all that. Yeah, I think he's wrong. But lots of people go for that. I mean, there was this one ex-Jesuit, I think he was Polish. He wrote something called the Moneta Secreta, which was like it was like these secret rules for the Jesuits that he said that he had gotten a hold of these secret rules before he left the Jesuits, and it was all these rules for how to basically go out and seize power in the world, and lots of people believed that document that he wrote, the Moneta Secreta, but in fact it was a forgery. It was fake. The guy made it up, and we can show that. I mean, every serious scholar knows that it was fake. Every serious scholar knows that it wasn't real. And yet somehow conspiracy theorists often believe it. There's another guy named Alberto Rivera who says that he was a Jesuit since the time he was like 7 years old or something like that. He's a charlatan. I mean, he's a liar. It's not true. But he tells you all of these crazy things about, what it's like to be a Jesuit. And he's never been a Jesuit. He never was one. And again, just do any amount of research and you'll realize that this stuff just is not true. It's simply a lie. So you have these conspiracy theories about the Jesuits that go everywhere. I think that hurts the reputation of the Jesuits. Maybe above all is that people will take a Jesuit that they don't like or don't like what he thinks and all that kind of stuff, and they say, or not only that, I mean, he theologically could be just wrong, theologically bankrupt, let's say, right? But because he gets attention and he grabs headlines, people assume that all of the Jesuits are like this, and they start saying, "Oh, those darn Jesuits, right? They've infiltrated the church, right?" So you look at history and you say, okay, so the Jesuits are in trouble because they're against Protestantism and in favor of the Pope. The Jesuits are in trouble because they're missionaries out in these different places. The Jesuits are in trouble because people just flat out lie about them. And then finally, when you actually get a Jesuit who's doing the wrong thing, and we say, all the Jesuits are like this. Simply not true, right? You get 3 Jesuits in a room, you get 4 different opinions about the Jesuits. I think that's crazy. The Jesuits are going to be effective in what they do in most cases, right? Okay, so we have some goofball Jesuits. I know some goofball Jesuits, right? But there are lots of Jesuits, tons of talent, big intellects, and when they use them the wrong way, people assume that the whole order is that way. Especially in terms of like the Jesuits being liberal. People presuming that the Jesuits are all liberal because they can name 3 or 4 Jesuits who most people can't name more than 2. But 3 or 4 Jesuits who are on the forefront of just kind of like liberal causes, let's say. But then, if you point out to them a handful of other Jesuits to say, that's the exception. Okay, so Father Mitch Pacwa, he's the exception. He's on EWTN. Father Joseph Fessio, who founded Ignatius Press, right? He must also be an exception. Then you have Father Robert Spitzer, right? Also on EWTN, big, very, very intelligent man. He's an exception too. Go listen to this podcast by Father Robert McTeague, and you're not going to get the impression that this guy is anything worthy of the name liberal, right? But people presume that these guys somehow must all be the exception, and every other Jesuit out there is a crazy liberal. I'm in the Jesuits. I've been a Jesuit since the year 2000, and my experience is that the Jesuits reflect the diocesan priesthood or the Catholic Church in general. So within the Catholic Church, you have some pretty far right guys. You have some pretty far right Jesuits. Within the Catholic Church, you got some pretty far left guys. You got some pretty far left Jesuits. I think the Jesuits in general reflect the Catholic Church. And I think that it really comes from a bad place when people presume that all Jesuits are the same. We are simply not. I also think that if you happen to be conservative, and I think most of the people who watch these videos probably lean a little bit conservative, and you say bad things about the Jesuits because you say, oh, they're so liberal, it's probably counterproductive to the conservative cause to lump all the Jesuits together. When you say those things, it hurts the reputation of even the good Jesuits. I'd go so far as to say some of the things I hear said are really, it's a sin to say the things that are being said. It's a sin. You should stop it. I'm thick-skinned. It's not like hurting my feelings, but it's a sin because it undermines the good work that a lot of Jesuits are trying to do. So judge each Jesuit as an individual, even as you might look at us all as a great big Society of Jesus. I think what keeps the Society of Jesus together is not because we're all liberal or all conservative and we all agree on everything. In fact, we don't. I do think, though, I've never met a Jesuit that didn't have at least some sincere love for who they believed Jesus Christ is. And, that can cover up a lot, right? That can keep people together a lot. That can overcome a lot when people believe that they're at least sincere in our love for who we believe Jesus is. And, we might disagree a lot on who Jesus is, but it does go a long way to know somebody sincerely loves Jesus Christ. So that keeps us together. The spirituality of St. Ignatius Loyola is still the thing. We all go through that kind of training that keeps us together that I think is absolutely invaluable. I mean, I will take a liberal spiritual director if he knows about St. Ignatius Loyola over, let's say, a really conservative guy who doesn't, right? In my mind, St. Ignatius Loyola hung the moon. And in that sense, I think the Jesuits deserve a much better reputation than they have. Now, you may say, I don't know the Jesuits have a bad reputation. I'm just going off of what the Google search term said, so that's where I got the idea for this video. I hope that it's helpful. Say a prayer for the Jesuits. St. Ignatius Loyola, pray for us. Amen.